We have technology!
How does a masterpiece worth billions simply vanish? The Amber Room, once called the eighth wonder of the world, was a dazzling symbol of wealth and artistry, until it disappeared without a trace.
The Amber Room is one of the greatest art treasures of Imperial Russia, disappeared with the Nazis and has yet to be found. In September 1941, during the siege of St. Petersburg, Nazi troops overran the Tauski Selo Palace. Inside the palace, these German troops discovered something that must been seemed otherworldly to them after they had spent the past 10 weeks fighting in the heat of the Russian summer.
Now you may say that this is different, but wait, where am I? Let me try something. What about this body? Wait. Ah, this is better. Now, this gonna be a different type of video, but hey, we'll have fun with it. Now this we're gonna be taking a look at Amber's room, and let's get our way onto our location of the day. As we wait to board, let's take a look. In September 1941, during the siege of Leningrad, as the Soviets, then called St. Petersburg, Nazi troops overran the Tuskegee Palace, the former summer resides of the Tsars in the suburban town of Pushkin. Inside the palace, these German troops discovered something that must have seemed otherworldly to them after they spent 10 weeks marching and fighting in the dust of the heat in the Russian summer. And away we go to the Amber's room. Now you may be thinking, what is this place? Well, now I am outside the palace in St. Petersburg, where apparently this amber room is. But it is said it was a barcode chamber made completely of amber and decorated with large mirrors and amber carvings and cupids and family crest nymphs and monograms. Called fitting enough, the amber room, the chamber, had been created in Prussia in the early 16th century and was later given to Russian Tsars Peter the Great. In its 2.5 centuries of existence, it has become famous throughout Europe and had been called, among other things, the eighth wonder of the world and the world's most expensive extraordinary works of art. Its estimated value today is more than $180 million. Now, standing in this room, the Nazis carefully dismantled the chamber and packed it in crates and shipped it to Konsberg Castle in eastern Germany, the ancient seat of the Teutonic Knights and the heart of their medieval amber trade. There, Erich Konch, head of the Nazi Party in East Prussia, had the room reassembled and advertised it is a German possession, now at last fully restored at its rightful owner. In 1945, however, as German war was ending with the Allies squeezing the Nazis from the east and the west, the room was once again dismantled and packed in 24 crates and stacked in the courtyard of the castle. From it is there disappeared and has not been seen since. The amber is fossilized tree resin that is about 44 million years old. Up to 90% of the world's supply is mined along the southern shore of the Baltic Sea. For millennia, resin had flown from coniferous trees and settled onto the forest floor in Eastern Europe. Then, as the Earth's plates moved and ice sheet formed and melted, the area became flooded and the Baltic Sea formed. From earlier times, bits and pieces of amber, which has been called the gold of the North, were torn from the seafloor and washed ashore to be picked up and treasured. It has been found most of the often on the east coast of the Baltic Sea, from the current site of Danzig in Germany north to Estonia. Eventually, an amber trade grew, and mining operations, first by men wielding large nets, were developed. Often these net wielders were slaves in the employ of the Teutonic Knights, an order that grew rich on the amber. By the 13th century, the Knights controlled the trade and had centered their amber commerce at the newly built Konsberg Castle on the Prego River. By 16th century, however, with the Protestant Reformation sweeping Europe, the Teutonic Knights renounced their Catholicism, becoming Lutherans, and forming the Teutonic Orders, Prussian territories, into the Duchy of Prussia as a Polish fief. Eventually, Prussia gained independence from any feudal obligations, and in 1701, Elector Frederick III was crowned as Frederick I, the first king of Prussia. Now, Frederick married his second wife, Sophie Charlotte, a great-granddaughter of England's James I, in 1684, and she invested most of her time and effort in artistic pursuits, one of which was to make the Prussian capital of Berlin shine. In 1696, when Frederick was still Elector, she asked the sculptor Andreas Sculptor to work on the interior redesign of the royal palace. Sculptor began searching in the palace storage cellars and found a number of chests filled with amber. He later claimed it was the largest collection of amber he had ever seen in one place. After discovering the Amber's palace cellars, Skolch convinced the idea of using it to create an entire room made of precious substance. He developed a design for such a room, a complete chamber decorated floor to ceiling with amber panels backed with gold leaf and covered with mirrors, polished moss, carvings of nymphs, Cupid, and angels, coats of arms, monograms, and inlays. Some so small that observers needed to use a magnifying glass to view them. He hired the Danish carved Godefried Wolfram and put him to work, developing the amber room. Over the next several years, Wolfram evolved a method of bonding amber sylvains into larger pieces and created 46 massive amber panels, a dozen of them 12 feet high. In 1705, however, Sophie Charlotte died and Scotia fell out of favor. He was banished from court and the carver Wolfram was fired. In 1730, Frederick I died and was succeeded on the throne by his son, Frederick William I, a no-nonsense man much more interested in building a strong Persian army than he was in tinkering with amber's panels. The unfinished amber room remained at the Berlin City Palace until 1716 when Russia Peters the Great entered the table. That year, Peter visited the court of Frederick William and talked of the unfinished amber room. Peter had always been an admirer of the gold of the North, and the Frederick, uninterested in the amber anyway, gave the amber panels Wolfram had assembled and carved to Peter as a gift. The amber panels were carefully disassembled, packed in crates, and loaded on 8 carts that slowly moved the precious cargo to Peter's summer palace in the Russia capital of St. Petersburg. When the panels arrived, some pieces were broken and other pieces were missing. Besides the broken and missing pieces, no one could seem to figure out how the remaining panels should fit together, and no instructions from the banished Danish carver who had created the panels or the Persian sculptor who had convinced them could be found. The amber was stored in the palace and languished there for almost 20 years after Peter's death in 1725. In 1743, however, Empress Elizabeth ascended the Russian throne, and one of her first acts was to have the amber transferred to her new winter palace on the river of the Neva, where the Italian sculptor Alexander Martelli was put in charge of assembling the panels and installing them in a large hall at the palace. Somehow, Martelli solved the puzzle of assembling the chamber. Elizabeth was still dissatisfied and had the room moved 3 more times and embellished with additional mirrors and amber mirror frames. Eventually, the chamber covered more than 55 square meters, or 188.4 square feet, and contained over 6 tons of amber. In 1755, however, it was again moved, this time to the palace of Elizabeth's favorite niece, Catherine, at Tosko Sully. Catherine, who came from the amber mining region on the Baltic Sea, ascended the Russian throne herself in 1767 and eventually became known to history as Catherine the Great. Czarina Catherine added another 900 pounds of amber to the room, replacing some sections with large windows. She also commissioned 4 stone mosques corresponding to the sense of sight, taste, touch, and hearing. The amber room remained in splendor until shortly after June 22nd, 1941, when 99 German divisions, including 14 Panzer divisions and 10 motorized divisions, stormed into the Soviet Union along a front from the Baltic to the Black Sea for a month. The Nazi Blitzkrieg was unstoppable, and in the north, the armored group under Field Marshal William Wither von Lieb moved closer to its objective, the Soviet Union's second city of Leningrad. By the midst of August, German troops were approaching the city, their artillery and aircraft attacking it. By the end of the month, the battle for Leningrad had become a siege. A Soviet counterattack in January 1942 failed to break the siege, and the fighting continued until January 1943, when Soviet forces executed a plan to open a land corridor to the beside city. After 6 days of heavy fighting, the corridor was established with German forces cleared from the southern shore of the Lake Ladoga for 7 miles. But it was not until years later that the Germans were driven 50 miles from the city and the siege was considered broken. By then, however, it was too late for the Tokisoi Palace and the Amber Room. Tokisoi, translated as Tsar's Village, is part of the town's Pushkin, situated 24 miles south of Leningrad Center. In September 1941, during the early stages of the siege, German forces overran Pushkin and plundered a number of Soviet-Russian national monuments there. Among them was the Tsar's place that Catherine the Great had built in the 18th century. Pushkin remained in Germans' hands until its liberation by the Red Army on January 24, 1944. As Germans approached Pushkin and Leningrad in 1941, the Soviets took steps to save as many of the treasures housed in the cities as possible, including the Amber Room. The curators of the chambers first tried to disassemble the room panels, but over the years the amber had dried and become brittle. As attempts to remove it undertake, the fragile amber began to crumble. Rather than moving it and subject to the amber's damaging, as a false room was constructed inside the amber's room walls in an attempt to hide it. Some sources asserted the amber room simply covered by wallpaper. When the Germans occupied Toshi's cellar, probably already aware of the famous chamber and its location, they discovered the amber room and were able to disassemble it under the supervision of a pair of experts. The amber's panels, mirrors, cherubs, and nymphs were carefully packed. On October 14, 1941, Ritzmaster Gromslams Lunchbach, who was in charge of the disassembly, had packing, ordering the 27 crates shipped to Konsberg for display in the town's castle. The amber room, he concluded, was going home. The chamber was carefully reassembled at Konsberg and became another trophy of the Third Reich military's prowess. On November 13, 1941, the newspaper Konsberg Allgemeine Zeitung reported on the opening of an exhibit part of the room at the castle. By the end of 1943, however, Konsberg was coming under increasingly frequent Soviet bombing attacks. The room was being again disassembled, and the crates were stored in the castle cellar. In January 1945, as the war continued turning against Germany, Koch received instructions to load the amber panels into 24 strong boxes and prepare them for shipment. As soon as this was done, Koch wrote, "I shall evacuate the panels to Winsberg near Reuchlin in Saxony." It is known that the packing was completed on January 15, 1945, and the crates were piled in the courtyard of the castle. But the trail ends there. The crates are believed to have never arrived in Lunchbach, and whether they even left Konsberg is unclear, although some eyewitnesses have reported seeing them stacked at a railroad station. Over the years, a number of extensive researches, including several by the Soviet Union, have proved fruitless. In 1997, a piece of room was found. An Italian stone moshkin, known to have part of the room turned up in western Germany. It was owned by a family of soldiers who have helped pack the amber room at Konsberg in January 1945. As recently as 2008, another alleged discovery of the amber room was announced. Radar scans were reported to have detected a large amount of metal believed to be dense for copper in an abandoned copper mine in Dunsterdorf, Saxony. Some observers, including Hans-Peter Heinstein, mayor of Düsseldorf, claimed the mine was the burial site of the amber room. Until now, the amber room has never been found and is still one of the greatest World War II mysteries. Now, what do you think about the amber room? Do you think it's still out there? Do you think there's a room full of this magical amber, or do you think it just got broken down into pieces? Me, personally, I think it's just broken pieces that's been lost and never will be found. But hopefully there's a room out there. Hell, if I had that much power, look at my hand. I'll have the Infinity Gauntlet. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know it's a little bit different and weird, but who knows? Tune in to the next episode on Wednesday, the Fuku Thought.